As we approach the November 6, 2012 election, to some extent there will be differences in the outcome based on who is elected to the White House and who may or may not dominate the House or the Senate. But there are some fundamentals that are not going to change for people with disabilities. We have reached a point in our financial history at the federal level that the current expenditure pattern is not sustainable, even if there are increases in revenue rather than just taking it all out in cuts. And that has great implications for the field and for the lives of children and adults with disabilities and their families. However, that problem is further compounded by the financial issues in most of the states where revenues also are not keeping up with expenditures. That's sort of a piece of the bad news. Some of the good news pieces are we have a Department of Justice Civil Rights Division today that takes full ownership of the Olmstead Supreme Court decision and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which clearly articulates for all settings and all services that public funds must be provided for services in the most integrated setting appropriate for the individual with a disability. And recently, the Department of Justice has begun to apply this to rehabilitation and sheltered workshops. It is no longer just about institution versus group home. And that's clearly, the statute is broad. The regulation that I just cited, written by the Department of Justice in 1991, is also very broad. It covers all publicly funded services and supports. Where that becomes more good news is when we line that up with increasingly evidence-based best practice and what makes sense for people with disabilities regarding their lives, starting in early childhood all the way to adulthood. And so the opportunity now is to say, are we willing to realign the resources we do have, which are big, we're talking billions of dollars, and line them up with an integration mandate and an individualized mandate for accountability and outcomes and equity of resources that lines up very nicely with person-centered planning. One person at a time, tied to value-based goals and outcomes. So let's back up. Let's look at the big federal picture. And people have said to me, well, if Obama's reelected, Medicaid is safe. The facts do not confirm that. During the 2011 budget negotiations, the Obama administration had 3 different proposals on the table to reduce the federal Medicaid expenditures. Not to do a block grant, not to do some of the other things that other candidates are proposing, but I suggest Medicaid is on the table next February and March, regardless of the outcome of the election. States will get less in the out years. That's going to happen, and that is even avowed by some of the most liberal budget houses in Washington, D.C. So, how do we make it better? Well, Medicaid gives us unbelievable license to do things that 10 years ago we could not do with Medicaid funding, including all kinds of career development, supported employment, customized employment, supported living, self-budgets, individual budgets. There are rules and guidance for all of this, which we say we value. We say we value it in the DD Act: self-determination, independence, productivity, integration, inclusion. That means you're in control. An individual budget gives you control. Secondly, the ADA says the goals are equality of opportunity, independent living, economic self-sufficiency, and full participation. Are those words real, or are they going to be hollow promises? We now have the opportunity to suit the actions to the words and really deliver what we said we believe in. And if so, that means giving up the sacred cows and not circling the wagons to maintain the day-hap centers. the sheltered workshops, the licensed group homes, the segregated schools, the self-contained classrooms. We have data, and increasingly compelling data, that kids with disabilities who grow up with kids without disabilities are going to have a better life on both sides of the equation. We have a major national commitment to the core curriculum in this country, with caveats for kids with the most significant disabilities, and Connecticut is one of the states in the core curriculum demo, and the federal government has put a lot of money into this. As we move toward transition years, there is a letter from the Secretary of Education, I take that back, the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education, Melanie Musgrove, to Wisconsin, clearly defining that transition services, if they include placement in work, which they should, have to meet all the requirements of free appropriate public education and least restrictive environment. She does make a caveat that segregated sheltered workshops are not precluded, but for advocates to understand, least restrictive plays here, and the work experience ought to be at a real job or job sites in the community. And then we have the opportunity to fulfill all the transition amendments of IDEA around employment or post-secondary education, independent living, functional community living. I've read it, it's statutory. I didn't write any of those. It doesn't say DAHAB is an outcome. It doesn't say sheltered work is an outcome. It doesn't say group home waiting list is an outcome, and it certainly doesn't say ICFDD is an outcome. So as a result, we have got to get clear, starting in early childhood, what are the goals? And I've said to others, if I were king for the day, in bold red letters at that first IFSP and then IEP, I want every strategy and every objective tied to independent living, economic productivity, and full citizenship. And I'm not a Pollyanna, not everybody's going to get there, but those goals are not negotiable for anyone. And then when kids leave school, they go to post-secondary, that's great. If they're going to work, they have a job before they leave, and then they move right into the adult support system seamlessly, and they keep on going, and they have a functional life in the community. The message now must be return on the investment to the taxpayer, and right now the data are terrible. The return is horrible, and it's expensive for not much of anything. So it's time to seize this opportunity of finite resources, a clear mandate of civil rights, increased evidence of best practice for individuals with the most significant disabilities, and the foundations of our legal mandates, and say we have to reform, we have to modernize, we have to restructure, and we don't have a lot of time. If we pass this opportunity, my biggest concern is that within 5 years we will look back at this and say, what did we do wrong? Because then the dollars will be spread thin. We won't worry about waiting lists. Everybody will get a couple of crumbs, and we'll be back to a different kind of institution. We will have babysitting and daycare and domiciliary care, because we can't justify spending what we're spending today when the median household family income is $50,000 a year, and we have people on average in the state of Connecticut, New York, and others where the expenditure is $150,000 to $200,000 a year and no outcomes. So this is the moment. We have to realign the resources with the values, the priorities, the goals, and the evidence, and move forward in the rest of this 21st century to say we are going to be sure that people have meaningful lives, that they have greater control over their own lives, that they use resources effectively and efficiently, and in the long run we know we're going to need less money and people will be better off.
Thank you very much.